Hello everyone. Welcome back for part 2 of Who's Croaking, identifying Ohio's frog and toad calls. If you missed the first video where we covered Ohio's more commonly heard frogs and toads, it is posted on the Ohio Woodland Stewards website under the Resources tab. You just might have to scroll down a little bit to get there. But for this video, we will be learning the rest of Ohio's frog and toad calls. And some of these frogs and toads are not very common. Some are only living in certain parts of the state. So these calls may not be as commonly heard in some cases. Ready? Let's get started. Just for a little quick review, our frogs and toads belong to the class Amphibia, in which we find 3 orders. The salamanders over there on the far right side of the screen, the caecilians, amphibians that are specialized for burrowing that live in tropical areas right there in the middle, and the anurans all the way over on the left side. And that's where we find our frogs and toads. Here is the calendar of breeding activity for Ohio's frogs and toads. So different frogs emerge at different times of the year and begin calling at different times of the year. So this is what you're looking at. This is the time of year when each of these listed species are calling. Since we are now well into June, we see that 8 of our 15 species of Ohio anurans have already stopped calling. So knowing when frogs and toads are calling can really make ID easier by simply the process of elimination. So why are frogs and toads calling? Well, to find mates, which then leads to eggs, which then leads to tadpoles, right? Frogs and toads in Ohio need water to lay their eggs, so the males and females head to their breeding sites before they start calling. And once they're there, they start calling away. What do those breeding sites look like? Well, depending on the species of frog or toad, they're going to have different preferences for those breeding sites. Some are a little bit pickier than others, some are not too picky, and any pool of water will do. So in that bottom picture, you're looking at a vernal pool, which is a pool of water where that water level kind of goes up and goes down throughout the year. And that can be a really important breeding site for quite a few of our frog species and a few of our toads as well. Other breeding sites could be a pond or a lake, streams, creeks, swamps, marshes, etc. Sometimes even flooded fields are also important breeding sites. Okay, let's get started with our first frog. And we are going to learn these calls in order of emergence, or when they start calling, which remember starts early in the year. So for these first few species we are going to listen to, they have already stopped calling this year. All right, let's listen to our first one. Okay, so I have to apologize for starting off this video with perhaps a difficult species to ID or maybe one that you've never heard before. So this is the southern leopard frog. You will not hear this species unless you live in the southernmost part of Ohio, and even then you may never hear them because biologists aren't sure if they are still living in the state. But we need more folks to learn their call if we are ever going to find them, right? So that was the southern leopard frog. Now, in the last video, we learned about the more common leopard frog. And while these two species look alike, their calls are quite different. So let's listen to the northern leopard frog once again, just so we don't get them confused. We had a woodpecker calling in the back of that one as well. But I think the northern leopard frog has a very low guttural call, almost like a snore, punctuated with clucks and chuckles. And then here once again is our southern leopard frog. So still very guttural, but much faster and a bit more explosive. So here is our southern leopard frog. This species begins calling early in the year, in early March, and only for a short time until April. Southern leopard frogs have been documented in Athens and Lawrence counties in the 1960s, and then later in Scioto County in 2008. So once again, if you find one, please take a photo and submit it to the Division of Wildlife, and their website is right down there. If you go to that website, they do have a report wildlife sightings tab, so make sure to turn in your findings if you find or think you have found a southern leopard frog. It would be really great to find one in Ohio again. So southern leopard frogs inhabit meadows, pastures, wooded areas, and a wide variety of aquatic habitats. Okay, let's listen to our next species. So this one is maybe a little tricky, and maybe you thought it sounded familiar to a species that you learned during the part 1 Who's Croaking video. Maybe you thought, okay, that sounds a lot like the western chorus frog. And if you did think that, then good, you're on the right track. But it's not the western chorus frog. This call is very similar, but it's a little bit faster. So let's listen to the western chorus frog call, and then I'll play the call of this frog once again. So definitely a bit slower there. Kind of think again like a creaky rocking chair, and then I'll play the call one more time of our new species. So that call was definitely shorter, faster, and a bit more clipped. So here's the new species. It is the mountain chorus frog. So mountain chorus frogs chorus or call mid-March through May, and sometimes they end calling as early as April. Now in appearance, this species can also easily be confused with the western chorus frog and the spring peeper. However, the western chorus frog, let me pop up a picture, there we go, has 3 dark lines running down their back. So if you can get one in hand, visual ID can definitely help. And then the spring peeper is another one you can confuse it with. And here's a picture of our spring peeper. They kind of have those 2 dark lines on the back kind of in an X shape. Now the mountain chorus frog does have kind of 2 dark lines along its back. I know this picture isn't the greatest, but maybe you can somewhat make out 2 dark lines kind of in the shape of parentheses. Though sometimes those lines can touch and make an H, which again in hand, if you're looking at this little frog, you might think of a spring peeper, but thankfully the calls between a peeper and the mountain chorus frog are much, much different. In addition, mountain chorus frogs occur in southeastern Ohio, so that makes ID in the rest of the state a little bit easier. And here's our next frog. So that was a different one. Did anybody guess that call? That is the pickerel frog. So almost a very long, high-pitched snore. Calls are much faster than the northern leopard frog, if you kind of thought it sounded a little bit like that. You will hear pickerel frogs from March through early May. And if you're looking at that frog, you're thinking, well, it looks a lot like the leopard frogs. And you're right, it does. But one of the distinguishing features would be the row of dots running from the eye down the back. And those spots are more rectangular in shape in the pickerel frog, whereas they're more round in shape in the leopard frogs. Pickerel frogs, if you're able to get one in hand, they also have a yellow-orange coloration on the inside surfaces of their thighs, much like we saw in the tree frogs, if you remember that. They prefer clear streams over ponds and lakes, and they occur throughout eastern Ohio, and especially those counties that border the Ohio River. So that was our next species, and this picture might give a clue for some of you, especially on the sandy soils along this river that are in the picture there. And here's what this little guy or gal looks like. So this is the eastern spadefoot. So the call, I think, really, for me at least, it makes me want to go grab the WD-40 and grease a squeaky joint. In fact, my daughter's swing set sounds just like a spadefoot. So they start calling mid-April through August, and they call most frequently after a heavy rainfall, as they like to breed in the pool or pools of water that form afterwards. The spadefoot gets its name from the spade-like black horny projection on the inside of both of its feet. And here's a close-up picture of what that looks like. And the little red arrow is pointing to it. So what's the point of that? Well, the spadefoot uses this for digging. And so it will use that to kind of burrow itself in backwards into the soil, creating a nice little shelter underground. Eastern spadefoots are pretty rare in Ohio. This is an endangered state species. So it's known to occur in several of the southeastern counties in Ohio in soft sandy soils along riverine or in riverine floodplains. While it resembles a toad, it is not technically a toad. So it's in a different family from Ohio's other toads. Another somewhat identifying feature, if you have the spadefoot in hand, is that it has a vertical pupil. Now I know this is not a great picture. That picture just looks like it's a round pupil. I apologize for that, and I'll pop up a better picture here in a minute. But they do have vertical pupils, whereas other Ohio frogs and toads have horizontal pupils. So there's a better picture of what that looks like, and maybe you can kind of tell in that picture of the eastern spadefoot that its pupil is more vertical, especially when you compare it to our American toad that has that nice horizontal pupil. Ready for another one? Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to give it away right away because we're going to compare it to a species we listened to in part 1 of Who's Croaking. So you just listened to Cope's gray tree frog. If you recall, we listened to the gray tree frog in part 1. So I'm going to play the call of the gray tree frog so you can hear a little bit of the difference. So the difference between these two calls is important because it is the only way to reliably tell the two species apart. And even so, this only works when you have two males of each species calling at the same temperature. And that's because if the temperatures are cooler, say 60 degrees or less, the trills or the calls slow down, making it even more difficult to decipher the differences. So to me, to my ears, the big difference between the Cope's gray tree frog and the gray tree frog is the pace of those trills. I think the Cope's gray tree frog calls a bit faster. And so I'll play that one more time for you to listen to. Hopefully you could tell a little bit of the difference there. Okay, so the call is an explosive, prolonged trill like the gray tree frog, but it's faster paced. I think it's less melodious, and it's a little bit harsher of a call than the gray tree frog. Identifying the Cope's gray tree frog versus the gray tree frog, here's the good news, may only be really challenging to those of us living in the southern 1/3 of the state. So you see a little map there at the bottom right-hand corner. And the darker part is where the Cope's gray tree frog lives. So that might be where you really have to put your listening ears on to try to tell the difference between the two. In the rest of the state, it's a little bit easier because we are more than likely only going to be hearing the gray tree frog. So again, they're identical in appearances. So I promise you are looking at the Cope's gray tree frog here in this picture, though it could be a gray tree frog and you would be no more the wiser. Of course, neither would I. No, just kidding. This really is a Cope's gray tree frog. They call during the same time of year, April until mid-July-ish. And you can hear the calls especially before and after a rainstorm from trees around the pools, ponds, and swamp forest that they like to breed in. So remember, this is a member of the Hylidae family, and they had those really cool discs on the tips of their toes that allows them to really grasp onto surfaces. And they like to hang out a lot in the trees and call from above. So here's our next species. I think this one is an easier one to maybe identify. I don't think there are a whole lot of other frogs and toads that sound like this one. And there's a nice little picture of it, courtesy Bill Peterman. Thank you, Bill. This is the Blanchard's cricket frog. This is another member of the family Hylidae, along with our tree frogs and chorus frogs and spring peepers. So their coloring is influenced by their surroundings. They can really blend in. Unlike other members of this family, however, their toe discs are quite small. This is the only cricket frog in Ohio. So if you hear that clicking call, you can bet it's this guy. And I really think their call, I didn't mention this, I think their call sounds like marbles tapping together. So think of that when you hear the Blanchard cricket frog's call. They do begin calling in May, sometimes as early as April, and lasting until mid-August. In Ohio, this frog is a species of concern. If you don't know what that means, it means that there are concerns about their population status, but there isn't quite enough information to make a decision on listing them as endangered or threatened. Right now, they occur in the western 2/3 of the state, and they like to use open, sunny areas along the shores of rivers, creeks, and ponds to call from. So here we are, our last species. So in this recording, you're going to hear just one of this species calling, and then you're going to hear multiples. Anyone guess that one? Here's a picture. So this is the Fowler's toad. So this toad is named for S.P. Fowler, an early naturalist from Massachusetts. I think their call, I can definitely hear some similarities between the Fowler's toad and the American toad's call, but it's not nearly, or the Fowler's toad's call is not nearly as musical. I think it's very nasally and it's shorter. It lasts for only 1 to 4 seconds, whereas the American toad's call, if you recall, lasted sometimes up to 30 seconds. So in terms of distribution, the Fowler's toad, they're found throughout the state, but they do prefer a bit drier habitats and sandier soils than our American toads. So that was the Fowler's toad. Now, while the calls between the Fowler's toad and the American toad may be easy for you to decipher, when you have a toad in hand, it may not be as easy. So I wanted to point out some differences between the two species in this toad by toad comparison. So I'm going to pop up, just looking at the two species here, there are some differences. And maybe the easiest one would be to look at the hind legs and the size of the warts on the hind legs. In the Fowler's toad, the warts are much smaller and they're kind of grainy. On the American toad, they're a lot larger. And then the other way to tell the difference is to gently flip them over and look at their bellies, or rather their chins and their chests. So you're noticing some pigmentation, some dark spots, definitely more so on the American toad. And that's what you're looking for. So if you flip them over and you see a lot of those dark spots, it's most likely the American toad. Whereas the Fowler's has almost a completely clear chin and chest. And sometimes they're only maybe one or very small, tiny dots like you see here in this comparison. Though, even these characteristics don't always lead to a 100% identification, because they do crossbreed, and that can make identification by just their appearance alone difficult. So again, listening is probably the best way to tell the difference between these toads. So once again, we'll kind of review this calendar of breeding activity for our Ohio frogs and toads. We have now listened to all of our frog and toad calls here in Ohio. If you listened to part 1 as well, and now part 2, hopefully you've learned your different calls, and hopefully you can use these to identify frogs and toads that you hear in the future. I'll just review this really quickly. We went over this in part 1, but the best time to survey for these frogs and toads acoustically is in the evenings, warm nights, low wind speeds through March, starting in March through July. And I did want to talk a little bit about some conservation of amphibians. This is a group of species that is very much threatened. Globally, we are seeing many declines. In fact, they have the highest threat status of all terrestrial vertebrates. And yes, that's more than birds and mammals. So this group of animals, our amphibians, is without a doubt seeing some serious declines. And so what is threatening their populations? Numerous things. It's not just all one single thing, though habitat loss is the #1 threat. And habitat loss can look like loss of forests or fragmentation of forests. So amphibians are not an animal that generally moves really far distances or has the capability of moving quickly. So if they are cut off, say, from a breeding pool with a road or some other fragmentation, it can be difficult for them to survive and to successfully breed and to get from one habitat patch to another. Of course, loss of breeding sites can definitely be attributed to habitat loss. And then, other barriers or, again, lack of corridors, of ways for them to get from one habitat patch to another. Amphibians are also dealing with, again, a number of other threats, so disease, pollution, and pressures from exotic and non-native species. So what can we do to help them? If you saw part 1, you recognize this slide, but it's still just as good. So you can protect or create vernal pools. If you own a pond, if there's a pond on your property, there are a number of different things that you can do to help out frogs and toads. You can anchor logs, you can create some shallow edges, you can plant some plants that like their feet wet, or plant some plants along the edges of the pond to create those nice, safe, shady habitats that our frogs and toads tend to like. I wanted to mention some of the wildlife-related NRCS cost share practices. So NRCS, that is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And this is a list of just some of their practices. There are a good number of them that you could possibly do on your property. And there are qualifications, there are requirements, and so I do encourage you to talk to a professional as to which practices would suit you the best. And I'll tell you how to do that in just a minute. But I'm going to circle one here, and that's wetland wildlife habitat management. So this is a practice where you can get help and cost share assistance to maybe create a wetland or to enhance a wetland. And there are different practices that will help you create vernal pools, so just a small little pool as well. So I really encourage you to look into this. So here is how you can get some more information. So these programs are offered through the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. And this link, this quick link, will take you to their website. And then the link at the very bottom will help you to locate your nearest office if you prefer to just give them a call and ask them about the different programs. I mentioned that for frogs and toads, you can introduce some plants around your pond. I just wanted to give you a list to work with and to get you started. So on the left side are some plants that like their feet wet, so they do very well planted in the water. And then on the right are some trees and shrubs to plant along the edges of a body of water. And then I'll just finish up with some resources. This is one of my favorite resources. It's kind of if I get a question on identification or a question about, an Ohio-specific amphibian, this is kind of my go-to quick guide. This is the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, Division of Wildlife's Amphibians of Ohio Field Guide. If you're not familiar with the Division of Wildlife's field guides, they have a phenomenal list of field guides. They're so good. Obviously for adults, for you wildlife enthusiasts out there, but they're also great for kids as well. They have beautiful pictures and relatively simple to understand information. The downside, unfortunately, right now, the Division of Wildlife and the entire Department of Natural Resources, they're redoing their website, and so they don't have all of their resources online right now. So what I've done is I have made this resource available to you, and if you go to that link down there, that is a link to my new blog that I've just started. So it's very new. There's not much posted there, but I will have an article posted with some of these resources that I'm going to share with you here in just a minute, as well as this amphibian guide. So you can go to that link right there and find my post on who's croaking, and you can download this guide. So just a few other resources that I frequently use to learn more about our frogs and toads, or if I get questions. The Ohio Frog and Toad Survey, I really like that one. It has some really good Ohio-specific information. The second one down, that Amphibians of Ohio, that's a book, and it is definitely a coffee table book. It's a nice, thick book, but it is so great with, full of information, specific research-based information about our different Ohio amphibians. So that's a great one if you really want to dive in deep to some of these species. And then that one right there in the middle, Virginia Herpetological Society, is a really great website. Lots of good information on different species. And you can also listen to all the frog calls there as well. So that's another good source of information. And then, of course, on our Woodland Stewards website that you see right here, we do have a series of fact sheets on pond management. So, you know, if I got you thinking about your pond and all the other things that you'd like to do or need to do as far as managing your pond, do check out this list of publications to help you. So thank you all so much. I hope you enjoyed part 2 of Who is Croaking. Again, my name was Marnie Tichenell, and I hope you enjoyed learning more about Ohio's frogs and toads. Thank you very much.